The first mentions of the creatures occur in a British newspaper called The Spectator in the early 1900s. The old Royal Naval Air Service in 1917 and the newly constituted Royal Air Force in 1918 appear to have detected the existence of a horde of mysterious and malicious sprites whose whole purpose in life was to bring about as many as possible of the inexplicable mishaps which, in those days, as now, trouble an airman's life. End quote. Anyone who has seen the 1984 movie Gremlins probably has an image and mythos they associate with the creatures. But stories about them have been around for as long as man has been able to fly, and include a variety of different encounters and sightings. Physical descriptions vary from little elfish beings similar to humans, complete with double-breasted frock coats, old-fashioned hats with feathers, and pointy shoes, to more sinister, reptilian-like creatures with pointy teeth and ears, to wispy entities seemingly composed of mist or smoke. My favorite depiction is in Falling Hair, the Bugs Bunny cartoon from 1943, where the gremlin somehow embodies most of those descriptions, even appearing extraterrestrial in origin. And then there's the little demonic gremlins from the movie The Gate. My 10-year-old self would have slept better without seeing. Ooh. One common trait these sky sprites all share, however, is their ability to adhere to a plane's fuselage through incredible temperature extremes, high altitudes, and high winds. The term gremlins is most likely derived from the Old English word grem, which means to vex or annoy. Early representations of the creatures was of a skilled craftsman with a proficiency in machinery of all types, painting a slightly different picture. According to legends, they even helped usher in new technology and innovations such as the steam engine, and helped with Benjamin Franklin's work with electricity. Today, they are more known for mischief and mayhem. So now I have two separate images of gremlins. The helpful Mogwai, Gizmo, maybe even holding the string and key for old B. Frank's kite, and the mischievous Stripe, destroying a plane's engine as William Shatner loses his mind on the other side of the window. As most of us probably already know from public education, the first recorded flight took place in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The Wright brothers were able to fly their plane about 120 feet on their second attempt of the day on December 17, 1903. On their fourth attempt, Wilbur was able to fly the plane an impressive 852 feet in 59 seconds. It was the first powered flight, a single motor driving two propellers carrying the aircraft through the air. In 1911, the U.S. Navy was formed. In 1916, the U.S. Coast Guard was formed. Maybe lesser known than the Wright brothers and not as famous as Lindbergh, the first transatlantic flight was also an American endeavor and a milestone in aviation. On May 27, 1919, a mere 16 years after the first flight, and 8 years before Charles Lindbergh would attempt the flight on his own, the U.S. Navy's NC-4 seaplane took off and began its long flight across the Atlantic. Due to fuel and navigation restrictions, it wouldn't be a continuous flight. It took a crew of 6 people 3 weeks to make the trip. The NC-4 had 4 engines and could take off and land in water. NC stood for Navy Curtiss, referring to Curtiss Airplane and Motor Company, who helped design the plane. Navigation equipment wouldn't become a thing for a few more years, so the plane had to follow the visual cues of naval warships stationed about 50 miles apart the entire way across the Atlantic. 1923. A British pilot crashed his plane in the sea and later reported it was caused by tiny creatures wreaking havoc aboard his aircraft, sabotaging the engine, messing around with flight controls, and eventually dropping the plane into the water. The story became more and more popular, spread, and soon other Royal Air Force pilots were sharing similar tales. According to mysteriousuniverse.org, quote, gremlins were said to engage in such a myriad of bad behavior as sucking the gas out of tanks through hoses, jamming radio frequencies, mucking up landing gear, blowing dust or sand into fuel pipes or sensitive electrical equipment, cutting wires, removing bolts or screws, tinkering with dials, knobs or switches, jostling controls, slashing wings or tires, poking or pinching gunners or pilots, banging incessantly on the fuselage, breaking windows, and a wide variety of other prankish acts. There were even pilots who claimed that the creatures had telepathic powers and could create realistic illusions in a victim's mind, such as the appearance of ground or a mountain emerging suddenly from the clouds. They were also sometimes reported to be seen sitting out upon the nose of the plane or the wings of the aircraft in mid-flight, tampering with the wings or even the engines. On occasion, the gremlins were said to shout, giggle, whisper, growl, or otherwise make noise so as to distract aircraft crews, in particular gunners, as they were lining up their sights on an enemy, and pilots when performing maneuvers, for which total concentration was a necessity. Such reports spread quickly through the ranks, and by the end of the 1920s, it seemed like any pilot who had ever had an aircraft problem of any kind had seen the things, and they were commonly reported throughout the Royal Air Force by pilots stationed in such far-flung places as Malta, the Middle East, and India. Gremlins and their bothersome antics were reported throughout the 1920s and 30s, but perhaps the period of the most intense alleged gremlin activity was during the fierce fighting of World War II. Reports of gremlins were especially prolific among the UK's RAF, the Royal Air Force units, especially the high-altitude photographic reconnaissance units, the PRU, which flew perilous missions in unarmed, unarmored, Spitfires and Mosquitoes at great heights on photographic missions over enemy territory. It was during these harrowing missions, when pilots operated in bitter, biting cold, as heat was redirected to the cameras to keep them warm, that the little monster tricksters were regularly seen and blamed for all manner of otherwise inexplicable technical troubles and woes. In some cases, mechanical problems would arise only to mysteriously right themselves again as soon as the pilots landed or the gremlins were gone. The Battle of Britain, an enormous air campaign waged against the United Kingdom by the German Air Force during the summer and autumn of 1940 in particular, saw many cases of reported gremlin activity. So much so, in fact, that the British Air Ministry even acknowledged the problem and made serious attempts to investigate their phenomenon. The ministry even went as far as to have a service manual written up by a gremlorist, Pilot Officer Percy Prune, which was an official document consisting of a list of the creature's exploits, how to placate or distract them, and various ways to avoid accidents due to their presence, such as not displaying bravado, arrogance, or overconfidence, which was thought to attract the creatures. There were also posters that warned of the malicious monsters, as well as bulletins which often included the following ditty. This is the tale of the gremlins, as told by the PRU at Benson and Wick and St. Eval, and believe me, you slobs, it's true. And when you're 7 miles up in the heavens, that's a hell of a lonely spot, and it's 50 degrees below zero, which isn't exactly hot. When you're frozen blue like your Spitfire, and you're scared of mosquito pink, and you're thousands of miles from nowhere, and there's nothing below but the drink. It's then that you'll see the gremlins, green and gamboge and gold, male and female and neuter, gremlins both young and old. It's no good trying to dodge them. The lessons you learnt on the link won't help you evade a gremlin, though you thought you boast and you dive and you jink. White ones will wiggle your wingtips. Male ones will muddle your maps. Green ones will guzzle your glycol. Females will flutter your flaps. Pink ones will perch on your Persex and dance pirouettes on your prop. There's a spherical middle-aged gremlin who will spin on your stick like a top. They'll freeze up your camera shutters. They'll bite through your aileron wires. They'll bend and they'll break and they'll batter. They'll insert toasting forks into your tires. And that is the tale of the Gremlins, as told by the PRU. Pretty, ruddy, unlikely to many, but a fact nonetheless to the few. End quote. While reports seem to begin in the Royal Air Force, gremlins were not unique to the British or the military. Ironically, in what was supposedly the first solo transatlantic flight, famed aviator Charles Lindbergh claimed to have had assistance from some helpful sprites. Quoting Mysterious Universe again, one of the most famous alleged gremlin accounts from this period was made by none other than the renowned American aviator, author, inventor, military officer, explorer, and social activist Charles Lindbergh, as he was engaged in his historic non-stop solo flight over the Atlantic from New York to Paris in May of 1927. Lindbergh had been flying his single-engine, single-seat planes, the Spirit of St. Louis, from the Roosevelt Field in Garden City, New York, to Le Bourget Field in Paris, France, which was to be an epic 3,600-mile, 33.5-hour flight, and the first ever of its kind. In the 9th hour of being airborne, Lindbergh reported that he had suddenly felt somewhat detached from reality, and found himself surrounded by several vaporous, strange-looking beings within the cramped confines of his tiny cabin, which spoke to him and demonstrated incredibly complex knowledge of the navigation and flight equipment. Interestingly, in this case, rather than cause mischief, Lindbergh said that the gremlins actually kept him alert and reassured him that he would remain safe on his journey. Lindbergh kept this bizarre experience to himself for years until the account was finally published in his 1953 book, The Spirit of St. Louis. Interestingly, this would not be the only report of benevolent gremlin activity, as there were other accounts from time to time that told of the typically mischievous monsters helping pilots avert disasters or alerting them when to turn or change course or altitude, which showed there was more than one facet to whatever the things were. End quote. "3:30 p.m. A late summer afternoon at Marine Naval Air Station in San Diego. A military transport plane and its 13-person crew takes off for a routine flight to Honolulu. 3 hours later, as the plane was over the Pacific Ocean, a frantic distress signal was sent out.
Flight 1331 to base. Copy 1331. Well, attack. Mayday, mayday. Roger that. What's your name, sir? 1331, can you hear me?
No response from the radio. Worried the plane had crashed in the Pacific, yet always optimistically prepared, you survey the skies outside your tower. Then you see it. A plane flying low, ambling toward the airfield.
We need emergency response team to runway 6.
You ran down to join the ground crews outside, skipping steps as you go. On the airfield now, you watch as the plane limps in for a bumpy, sloppy emergency landing. Coupled with the heavy damage